Afternoon. Welcome, everybody. My name is Bill Rothermel. With me is Mark Gessler. I'll be your host at tomorrow's concours as the Master of Ceremonies. I have the pleasure of introducing today Mark Gessler, who is president of the Historic Vehicle Association. Mark's going to tell us a little bit about an individual who is perhaps unknown to many people, Amos Northup, and mistakenly, he is oftentimes called Amos Northrup. It is not with Grumman. It's Amos Northup is his name. He would probably, had he not met an untimely death and died at a fairly young age, we would be saying his name, many people believe, along with Harley Earl. He was a very talented designer who was, at the time, designers really were overlooked, and the company name was referred to. The body was by Murray, and in the instance of his case, he worked for Murray. He was not referred to, but he was really quite a talented individual. And Mark's going to tell us about him, his history, his life, some of the important vehicles that he was involved with relative to the styling leading up to the Graham Blue Streak and the Graham Spirit in Motion. So without further ado, Mark, lead us along.
So it's Valentine's Day, 1937. It's a cold afternoon. It's a Sunday. And Amos Northup leaves his house at 41 Cambridge here in Pleasant Ridge. He heads up to the corner of 10 Mile and Woodward Avenue. And along the way, he slips, falls, and hits his head. A day later, he passed away. We lost one of the great designers of the 20s and 30s with his death. He died, as you can see, at 48 years old, and less than 5 years after the introduction of the Graham Blue Streak, he is touted as the first American to promote streamlining and the originator of the streamline style. Those are AP articles that were around the country at that time, and you can also notice that his name was spelled incorrectly there too. Amos was born in 1889. This is a photo, and this is Amos there on the right, cute little guy. This is around 1894 or 1895, and this is the dawn of the automotive era. He would go on to attend Bellevue High School in Ohio, and recently was honored as one of their finest graduates. He then went on to the Cleveland Polytech Institute and studied under a fellow named Keller, who's a famous watercolorist. He then took a position, his first position, around 1908 or 9 with the Pierce Aero Company. I might mention here also that we have John Northrop with us today, if you'd stand. John.
Great to have you here.
John's father is Hiram, our grandfather is Hiram on the right there. And John, by the way, was born about 2 weeks after Amos passed. So he goes on to Packard, or on to Pierce Aero, and while at Pierce Aero, he introduces color for the first time, and is known for having imagined how cars and other vehicles could start to use color to be part of the styling. In 1924, he joins Willis St Clair of Marysville, Michigan. The cars were known for their sleek styling, their low center of gravity, the sweeping lines across the side, and because he came from, in fact, a stint with a cabinet maker, he was very keen on how the bodies were put together. So this, for the first time, as we understand, was the first time the doors were not, the edges of them were not covered over, and in fact, there were gaps there that they could control and at a high tolerance, and were able to be the first to do that. After Willis St Clair, he went on to the Willis Overland company with a brief stint in between with Murray. And at Willis, he was the chief designer. He was both the chief designer for Willis St Clair and Willis. And while he was there, the Willis Overland Company was the third largest manufacturer in the United States. He was brought in to restyle the line that exists because they were actually quite good sellers, and they wanted to add a bit of pizzazz. And so he added the styling of the lines on the side, and if you could see the predecessor vehicles, they were much narrower, they were smaller, and he actually used the available wheelbase, which he extended, to create something much more graceful, much more stylish at the period, and they were a very strong seller. He was also the designer for Willis Knight, the other part of the Willis Overland Company's product line, and did the Plaid Side. The Plaid Side was known for its novel use of the checkerboard pattern on the side of the vehicle, which embellished it, made it graceful and elegant all at the same time, without actually changing much at all about how the car actually was overall designed. So this was a way for you to take a look at something that would have otherwise been a bit staid and a bit sort of average and make it something fairly spectacular.
It was essentially the Corvette of the Willis Knight lineup. It was the halo car. The other thing that's interesting about that car, in addition to the grid work on the doors, the hood was raised, the center line of the hood was raised, and it came back and met around the cowl of the car, and then you had the raised line on the belt line as well as the doors. His theory behind the grid work was that it was to lower the car visually and make it a more interesting look to the car. The name Plaid Side came about because the New York press, it was not called that, it's how he decided to do the car and paint the car. But the New York press nicknamed it the Plaid Side because the car looked like plaid paint, and the name stuck. There were about 400 of them built. It's one of my favorite cars. They were actually built by Griswold in Detroit, the bodybuilder. And they are recognized as a CCCA full classic, which is kind of cool. Sorry.
No, yeah. He went on to design then the Rio Royale 8. This was an astonishing car at the time to the public and to the press. It was the first time that you started to see a fully integrated body. The V of the front grille and the painting of the grille area was something new and something novel. The graceful lines that went across the car actually enveloped the rear gas tank for the first time, and you can see that there is no radiator a cap that is exposed. It is under the hood, and that's the first time that happened. This is actually the first car that is being delivered here in Michigan to a fellow who owned 16 Rios before that, and this is the very first Rio Royale 8.
Also the first car that's reputed to have been designed with the use of a wind tunnel.
Exactly. This the wind tunnel. The wind tunnel was over at Detroit University, and they did a scale model at the time. And this was the first time that we're aware of that a wind tunnel was applied to automotive design in the U.S. at least. Next came the Blue Streak. This is December 1931. We're in the depths of the Depression. The Graham brothers had introduced their first car in 1928. They sold over 70,000 of their first model. That was almost a record. It was only the Plymouth, when it was launched, that sold more. So they were off to a great start. But then the Depression hit in 29, and then by 1930 and 31, the automobile industry was in the tank. Unemployment here in Detroit was almost 50%. Throughout the country, it was about 25. Bread lines, soup kitchens. Imagine trying to sell a car. So what did the Graham brothers do? The Graham brothers were very successful businessmen. They had previously had a glass bottling company. They had sold their interest in their trucking business, their truck business, to Dodge. And with the cash that they had from that, they sold out and started the Graham Page Company by buying Page of Detroit. So here we come, fast forward to 1931, the introduction for 1932 of their new car. Because things were so bad at the time, the manufacturers all got together and decided that they would, in fact, all launch together at the New York Auto Show and then subsequent at the Detroit Auto Show. So this was for the first time that there was really not this scramble to be out there first. So there was actually rules around this, when you could actually have and invite the press. So I think this was, in fact, the 19th of December was the very first day that they were able to actually launch it. And they did it here in Detroit, but they also did it all over the country. They had shipped cars out, and this is from Altoona, Pennsylvania. And you can see it says, reflects a new style of cars for 1933. So they were actually saying that this car was going to be well ahead of what people expected. So here it was, the Graham Blue Streak. It was designed from the bottom up. What the Graham brothers decided was that they needed something to shock America. They needed something that would be striking and completely unusual and really try to bring customers into the showrooms. They had to come up with something that was going to be so spectacular that you just couldn't resist buying it. They started out with a chassis that was completely redesigned, that now had the rear axle going through the chassis and lowered the car about 2.5 inches. They had a new engine that had an aluminum head that was high compression 8-cylinder engine, so it was quite powerful. And they had new styling lines designed by Amos Northup. It was announced all over the country. This is the Philadelphia Inquirer, and here you have the Blue Streak. Many of them were, in fact, in blue, but they had a number of different shades and different colors, as had been Amos's signature for the automobiles that he helped pen. At the time, it was looked at as described as a truly modern motor car. But what they focused on when they first came out with this car was not the styling. And so as we go back and take a look now, looking at the records that exist around this, we sort of wonder as to whether or not they were not sure exactly how this was all going to come off, how the design would come off. Because if you take a look at all the details that are in these brochures, and we have some of these in the back, these are reprints of the 1932 brochures, you'll see the things that they're focused on in the brochure is really about the handling, the performance, and somewhat about the styling, but it's only a minor point. Well, a year later, and by 1933, it's the most imitated car on the road. They called it the most imitated car on the road because it was the most imitated car on the road. And the particular features that we look at that are important to this styling, are in fact the sides of the fenders. This was the first time that a fender actually had a side like that, a valance that came down. And this became all the rage. So by 1933, I think 14 other manufacturers had taken this lead, and fenders started to have sides. And then by 1934, all fenders looked like this. Amos's overall view of this was to try to give the automobile a much more integrated design. He didn't like the idea of the fenders just simply flowing over the car as planks, and you being able to see the insides and the undersides of those fenders, the dirt, the mud that exists there. So they gave the fenders some sides. Also, it has this flowing line, and you can see that we've gone from something, if you're familiar with cars from the immediate prior time, there was a lot of chrome that was on the car. Here you can see a very monochromatic look at a car, and that for the first time was to try to integrate all these pieces. You can see that the headlights are actually the body color, and that was the first time that was done. And of course, over time, those headlights get integrated into fenders and become much more integrated into the car. The idea was to have a harmonious design and something that was hiding a lot of the underside of the car, and in fact, the chassis. You can see that you really are not looking at the chassis on the side of the car, and in prior times, you simply had the body slapped on top of a chassis, and it really wasn't part of the car, and often painted the chassis color and not the same color as the automobile. He really added a sense of almost a custom automobile to this at a time, and this is a production car that is mid-priced at about $1,000. One of the most striking features of the automobile is its front waterfall grille. For this car, he was all about the motion, or the idea that this car should look like it's moving while it's sitting still. Lean back the grille, he leaned back the windshield, and mimicked that with the louvers on the side. In 1933, this is the 1933 car that's outside, it had these beautiful pair of bumpers in the front there. They were so-called the Mae West bumpers because it was like a striking, plunging blouse.
Plunging neckline.
Plunging neckline is what it was called. So in fact, it was a little bit outrageous at the time. They called it the Mae West bumpers, and you could ask for the actually standard bumper, which is just a standard wraparound if it was too racy for you. This gives you a better view of the slope of that grille, and of course the car is out front here. It had 17-inch rims. These are the wood rims, and balloon tires at the time were all the rage. Low pressure and a softer ride. When we talk about the chassis, this banjo chassis with the axle going in through it, enabled the car to be lowered, and the springs were on the outside of the chassis, which created a lower center of gravity overall for this car. And by doing so, the car handled amazingly well. In fact, the salesmen, when they launched this car, were so impressed that they would start driving around corners pretty carelessly, and they had a few of the cars that went off the road and tumbled off the side of the road. So they had to put out a memo to say, look guys, the car handles very well, but the handling isn't quite that good. So the car had a bit more power than cars that they were perhaps used to, and was sticking to the road unbelievably, and I think the salesman decided that let's see what the limits of this are. In the back, you can see that the gas tank is no longer exposed. And again, previous cars to this, you had an exposed gas tank in the back. Also, the car is much wider. Because of the way the springs are on the outside, the car is wider, and it was touted as wider than it was tall. So this was the first time that happened. But importantly, it was much lower than other cars, about 2 or 3 inches lower than other cars at the time. And as we put one into a trailer today, we find that we've just got a little room on either side that we got to be really careful with that. The paint. This was the first production car to use a metallic paint. It was called Pearl Essence at the time because it was made out of fish scales. So there was apparently pounds and pounds of fish scales that was added to the lacquer at the time. And the reason it was called Pearl Essence is because they made imitation pearls out of fish scales. So that's why it was called Pearl Essence. They didn't have enough cars and colors, and you couldn't reproduce the colors on paper very well. So what they did is they put models of the automobile in all the different colors in their dealerships. And so these models were about this big, and you can see the original Pearl Essence here, and this is courtesy of Phil Neff, a photo that he was able to give me. Doug Clark up with Hagerty up here in the front row. His father was the recipient of one of these models when he was a little guy. That's a picture of him and his buddy. His buddy's father got a brand new blue streak, and both of the little guys were given one of these models, and that model survives today as one of Doug's childhood toys that he got handed down to him. That was a newspaper article at the time. The interior. Amos Northup was all about the interior. He came from a stint as a cabinet maker and was very familiar with fabrics and color. And his whole statement was, look, we want this automobile to feel like your home. We do not want it to feel like something different that you're getting into, that has screws exposed everywhere and that has, that just looks like it's an assemblage of bits and parts. And you can see that this is a very luxurious interior that is, for the most part, devoid of all of that. He was also one of the first really to apply what we would call today human-centered design. Some of his lectures at the time at the SAE and at other places, he was broadly sought after as a speaker about streamlining and the future of the automobile as one of the top designers. He talked about the fact that we shouldn't be designing cars by having the engineers develop it and then us as stylists and designers to try to stuff people inside this car. In fact, we should be looking at the ergonomics of it. We should look at the interfaces that they're using. We should look at the environment that they're in and make it comfortable for them. And in fact, that's why this singular dial, and the integration of all the important metrics that you need to run an automobile is all integrated in a singular dash display. Of course, the Graham Blue Streak was fast for the time. It was considered a very good performing car, and was the Indianapolis pace car in 1932. The fellow behind him, in the back of that picture there, the fellow that looks much taller than everybody else, he's not standing on anything. That is Cannonball Baker. Cannonball Baker was known for his cross-country races that he did. He started out in motorcycles on the early part of the century, and then was hired by automobile manufacturers to take their cars across country in record time. By the time that he got to the Graham Blue Streak and was hired by the Graham Company, this would have been about his 145th trial of going across country to set yet another record. And he did. That record is 53 hours and 30 minutes. If you take a current Google map, you back out the math, that's about 61 miles per hour. 61 miles an hour. That is at a time that there were no paved roads west of the Mississippi until you got to LA. That is at a time that there were no interstates. And I know we all do a lot of traveling, and to do a 60 miles an hour just to average on a trip with the stops, come on, it's tough today. So you can imagine the kind of speeds that he was going through, blowing through towns and little villages across the country.
Clearly not worried about stone chips.
Yeah. So he makes it across country and creates this incredible record. So we fast forward ahead to Brock Yates and the inspiration for the Cannonball Run. And the inspiration for the Cannonball Run in Car and Driver back in the 70s, when he wrote the article, was this particular run by Cannonball Baker. It was his last. He went to his grave with saying that this was the most fantastic achievement of his life, that he was able to take a car from coast to coast in a record time that I'm not sure has ever been beaten. I'm not sure it's ever been beaten because everybody else who's done it has typically done it as a team. And today, when they do the Cannonball runs, it's a team of people. They swap out drivers all the way across the country. He claimed to have only slept for a half hour. The Grahams were brilliant marketers. I mean, with Cannonball Baker, with the records that he had, not only with the cross country, but hill climbs, they also were the first to actually involve a toy company. So the car was such a hit at the time. In fact, at the Detroit Auto Show, when asked in 1932 what the most beautiful car was, 45% of the participants said the Graham Blue Streak. So it was a hit. So they turned it into a toy. And the toy became the #1 seller of the Depression era. Something on order of 4 or 5 million Graham toys were sold. It's about 4 inches long, about 1 to 43 in terms of sizing. And this is an example. But they came in limousines, they came in trucks, they came in tow trucks. It was all adapted from this central design of the Graham Blue Streak. And every kid knew what it was. So it's much like when I was growing up, and perhaps you were growing up, there were certain car toys in your life that you just absolutely knew. That's when you were in the Depression, this is what you wanted for Christmas. Amos Northup was a big voice at the time around streamlining, the future of streamlining, and the future of design. Now, we have to remember that back in this period, when he started out, even with Will St Clair, this was not a discipline. This was not a formalized discipline. And when Harley Earl joined General Motors in 1927, the idea of having a styling department was something completely new. The engineers actually probably hated it. These were the guys over there that would do color and the rest of the stuff and, embellish their engineering. They clearly were not to have a seat at the table. So we can see through his writing over the period that, and this is an article that was in SAE back in 1936, where he went to great lengths about his frustrations as a designer. The idea of the constraints that he had, how he wanted to push things forward. He was always, as somebody said, he was always zigging when the rest were zagging. He was always one step ahead. He was always trying to push the envelope, but he was always held back. It went further than just automobiles. He was such an important designer at the time, he was asked to start designing the hulls of ocean liners, to design locomotives, and to use his similar styling capabilities to bring streamlining to the masses and to many other products. Until 1937, on Valentine's Day. This is the house that he bought around 1928. It's 41 Cambridge Street if you want to go by. We went by a couple weeks ago when we were out here with the Graham and announcing the seminar, and we were able to have the owner give us permission to put the car in front. At that time, this was known as the car that everybody wanted in their driveway, and I'm sure Amos might have had one. Before his death, he had one final project that he was working on, a major project. And this is again the Graham brothers, who by this point in time, their business has continued to slip. Their resources were not what they were in 1930 or 1928. They were getting a little slender. But they wanted to do it again. They wanted to go back to the well, if you will, to try to design something that really was going to be fantastic again. He was going to try to shock the world. And at that time, as you can see from the ocean liner picture from here, he was looking at streamlining as this idea of spirit of motion, this forwardness, like a blurred old photograph that had the car sort of leaning forward. And with this developed the Graham spirit of motion that was launched after his passing. The spirit of motion was a hit in Europe. In the US, not so much. It spelled essentially the end of the Graham Company. The Grahams left the automobile business after one other model in the early 1940s. They took their remaining assets and bought a piece of property. You may have heard of it, Madison Square Garden. Fast forward to 2014. We had launched the National Historic Vehicle Register to fill a gap in our heritage inventory. We have the National Register of Historic Places. We have the fantastic Smithsonian Institution and Aerospace Museum that was launched back in 1976. But in terms of anything relating to the automobile, in a deep way, America really has not done much in terms of the federal government. We launched the National Historic Vehicle Register with the Shelby Daytona Coupe, the first prototype, in January of 2014. The criteria are an association with an important event, association with an important person, design or construction value, and that's where the Graham fits in, as a piece of design that was a tipping point from the old way of designing cars to a new way of designing cars. Or informational value, such as the first, the last, the most well-preserved example, or perhaps the most well-restored example. This is how our work works, if you will. We go through the eligibility, we do our research, we do the photography, we 3D scan, and that goes to a line drawing. We tend to do short and long-form documentaries and do press releases and social media. Our objective is to share America's automotive history with the American people. It's that simple. This all goes into the Department of Interior, then to the Library of Congress, where these materials, these comprehensive reports, are held effectively in perpetuity. The objective is for all this to be held for 500 years. Back in 2014, we had our first Cars at the Capitol event on the National Mall, and we selected one automobile per era that was effectively an orphan brand. And for the 1930s, it was this 1933 Graham Blue Streak. Here it is on the National Mall, and it's being 3D scanned. That's what the papers are in the windows, and you can maybe see a tripod in the back there. We did this in conjunction with the Trust for the National Mall and had an exhibition of these 10 vehicles. After that, we went up to the NB Center for American Automotive Heritage, and this is Nicola Bulgary's collection in trust to be maintained for future generations. And we set up to do the photography up there. We really needed what we need is to be far away from the automobile to limit the distortion. All of these photographs go into the Library of Congress as is. So we were describing the kind of work that we were doing, and that's my colleague Casey Maxon, our photographer and historian, set up there, and this is the kind of things that we had to do. We have to situate the automobile and then turn it, and then reset it at exactly the same distance away so that we limit the distortion and that they're all consistent. This is what the overall plan of the NB Center looks like, and what we were offered after Mr. Bulgari saw what we were doing. He came to us and said, "Would you guys like us to build you a place to do your work, a national lab, perhaps?" We said yes. Well, wasn't too hard. So a year ago, this month, we opened our national lab. That is the photographic facility, and inside there, a car that probably everybody in the audience knows. It's the Buick Y-Job. We honored Harley Earl a year ago, July, and it was unveiled at our grand opening of the national lab. We're unveiling it there as the 14th automobile on the National Historic Vehicle Register. Since then, we've had support from your Michigan senator. Senator Peters and Senator Portman from Ohio have put forth a bipartisan support for a separate part of our National Heritage Inventory called the National Historic Vehicle Register. It's an act that is now being considered in the Senate, and we hope that we'll have one in the House as well. So today we're here to honor Amos Northup, his legacy as a forgotten person 80 years ago who passed away. Because the Graham Company went away, because Amos had an untimely early death, much of their combined legacy has sadly been overlooked. The Graham brothers were geniuses. At a tough time in competing as an independent, whether 15th or 17th or 18th in America, they had some clever things that actually led to much of what we continue to do today. So as everybody who is a designer in this room knows, that everything looks at aerodynamics. They didn't quite know about what they were doing back then. That was a long time ago, more than 80 years ago. And we're here also to, at least for us, to say a few words about Nicola Bulgary's commitment to helping us with our program make automotive heritage an important cornerstone in our heritage inventory. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to open it up for questions. Sherry, in a moment. Hang on a second. Hang on. And we'll open it up for questions. And then we have the Graham Blue Streak outside, which will be on the show field tomorrow, along with other Northrop design cars as a display class, which should be a real treat to see them all grouped together. There they are. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Voila, it works. So without further ado, we'll take some questions, and then we'll head outside to take a look at the car. Sherry, back to your question.
So first of all, thank you for such an informative presentation and for what you're doing as far as historic vehicles. My question is, when you said everyone copied what Mr. Northup had done, is there no trademark or patent on automotive style or design?
So we've gone back through and started to take a look at the patents. There were definitely patents that were filed. They were pretty narrow in what they could actually claim. So things around the windshield and how it was tilted and how it was all integrated together. It was those sorts of things early on. By the time the Spirit of Motion, there is actually a patent that they filed for the Spirit of Motion design, which actually had the fenders, the front fenders, enclosed. They obviously decided that maybe that was a little bit too much. But they did file a number. He was author of a number of patents. And we actually found some other patents, like for clocks that he was doing at the time, and some other products that he was probably involved with. But searching those patent records is not quite as easy. You can't just go in and say the inventor and get it. You actually have to have the patent number, so it's a little bit harder, it's a little bit more laborious. But we'd like to take a much deeper look at what he was filing around the Blue Streak and some of the other automobiles that he was designing. Thank you for that question.
No, I didn't mean you. I meant the people, the other car designers.
Oh,
Right after.
yeah.
How were they?
Well, I think, yeah, at that time, so the question is, how were others able to copy them, and were you not able to protect your designs back then? And I think the answer in general was no. Because there were the suits that were going on at the time. In fact, the Graham brothers sold out of Dodge, and Dodge thought that they were going to threaten to build trucks, but that was very much based on their legal agreement, and they were precluded from doing that. But I've not come across, at least in our research so far, any suits that actually had sort of bubbled up and that were at least newsworthy. Sir.
Amos Northup did some work again for Willis after their bankruptcy. I believe he did a 34 Willis sedan, maybe a coupe as well. I think I've seen a coupe, and also a 38 car. I remember reading.
Yes, that's true.
I remember reading a clip. I'm trying to think of the gentleman's name. I think it was Wilson, who was president of Willis after Mr. Willis passed away in 1934, saying that Amos Northrup was the greatest friend that the Willis company had ever had, because he designed the 1938 car that saved the company. That's the little chubby one with the fenders. He designed the 38 car that saved the company, and he did not charge one penny for that service. This was
Thank you.
elegy that
Just talk, yeah, go ahead.
this is a
I don't think it's on.
Yes, I think it is on. The answer
It's
is
not on.
absolutely yes. We have not. These are just representative of some of the more important designs, and which is not to say that the Willis 77 and the cars after that were not in fact important. They were very important. The Murray Body Company worked for a lot of the manufacturers, sometimes just producing designs, and sometimes actually producing the cars. And I mean that was their trade. So that's what they were out promoting at the time.
Okay.
that body became enormously popular with dragsters and
Oh,
so
absolutely.
on later. And I'm wondering if maybe they shouldn't be included in your list of.
Well,
work that
the
he
list
did.
is, yeah. So
I'm
I mean,
sure it's still growing. But,
yeah, well, there's the Hupmobile Century. I mean, there is a broad number of other cars that he has been involved with and have been credited for. We were able to bring 5 automobiles to the lawn. Obviously, we'd love to have all of his work and have all this completed, but we were given here by the organizers, and which we're incredibly thankful for, the opportunity to do 5 automobiles.
And the other importance is for Mark to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the HVA and the importance of trying to establish getting these cars recognized as important contributions to not only American culture, American design, much like buildings and things such as that. You heard me say too, and I should somewhat, not correct myself, but perhaps add to something I said earlier, that had he not passed, we would be using his name very much along the same lines as we would be Harley Earl. He was perhaps more Raymond Loewy than he was Harley Earl. He designed things other than just automobiles. We were talking about the ocean liners and other things that he branched out to do. Harley Earl was pretty much a car guy, And you had Raymond Loewy, who was an industrial designer, and of course his fame was the Lucky Strike logo, and then consummate Studemakers, and then all of the railroad locomotives for a period of time for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So he was perhaps a little more Loewy than I guess you could say he was Harley Earl, but nonetheless an extremely important designer. Excuse me. Do we have any other questions? And yes, I'll be right back here. Hang on.
While you're heading back there, Keith Flickinger, could you stand up just for a second? So Keith is the restorer that restored the Graham Blue Streak along with the 1940 Graham Spirit of Motion that's here. So when we go outside, I'll invite Keith to have some comments, and you may have some, you'll be wondering about how it was restored and all that. And we're very pleased to have Keith here. He's the curator for the NB Center of American Automotive Heritage. Yes, sir.
Hi, John Sanderson. Thanks for bringing this Graham history up like that. The three Graham brothers were building trucks in, I think, Evansville originally, and for Dodge. They used Dodge a lot, and that lasted from, I think, 1918, right around World War I, right up through when Walter Chrysler bought them in 28. My understanding was that the Chrysler deal, when they bought them, they weren't going to produce any cars. They were going to stay out of the car business. And when they didn't, they bought Page. Chrysler sued and lost. And I was wondering if you could shed any light onto how they managed to win that one.
Well, apparently what the agreement was at the time was that they wouldn't build trucks. And there seemed to be some discussion of a threat of the Graham brothers all of a sudden building trucks after they acquired Page. And so there was the clarification, at least in our reading of the history and what was written in period, that it was that suit that was thrown out. They were cleared to build automobiles, which was their intent when they bought Page. It was widely known that they were going into the automobile business. They had sold, I think, about 51. They had sold 51% initially to Chrysler, to the Dodge, to the Dodge company. The Dodge brothers had since passed, and then right before they did this, the Dodge company bought out the rest of their ownership, and so they walked away with a considerable amount of money and put them in fine position to effectively survive the Depression.
It was Chrysler that bought it, not Dodge. Dodge was owned by Chrysler
Right,
at that
right.
point. The other thing I thought was really interesting, you mentioned a bodybuilder in Detroit built one of their first cars, I think it was a Plaid car.
I mentioned that.
Yeah, it's Griswold.
And I never heard of that bodybuilder in Detroit before. Can you shed any light on that?
It's a small company. It was the name Griswold, Griswold, and I really can't tell you much more other than by coach builder standards, it was a small, very insignificant operation. It certainly wasn't a LeBaron or something like that. But the production run was about 400 cars from 29 to 31, and the bulk of the car were the roadsters. They built maybe 11 or 12 touring cars, something like that. I believe there are 2 touring cars known to exist, a left-hand and a right-hand drive car. John North Willis was a proponent of exports, so the belief is that the right-hand drive car was somewhere in South America at the time because he was shipping cars there, but it now lives back here in the United States.
Where were they located in Detroit, you know?
I don't know.
You're asking me Griswold? I can't answer that question. Yeah, sorry. We can find that out, though. We got something to do. Any other questions from anyone? Yes, but that's convenient. Thank you.
You think the central instrument cluster was partially to make it easy to do right-hand drive cars?
That is very likely a consideration, although the instruments on the 32 were centrally located so that they were able to do that. I would point out that Graham were very successful businessmen and already had tackled a lot of the export business. So they were very much had a very strong export business. They were very well organized in that. The cars were raced and went to concours in Europe. So and in particular in the UK, it was written about, and the car at the time set a number of records and was well received by the British media, press, and customers. Well,
I saw another hand.
oh, okay.
Up, there we go. Yep.
Just a quick one, please, if you would. The gentleman sitting next to me perhaps is too modest to want to say anything, but his name is Bill Porter, and he is a retired chief designer of both the Pontiac and Buick Studio. And he probably wouldn't want me to say that.
Thank you for coming
But
today.
I did anyway. My good friend.
Well, I also say, John, that in having the great opportunity to meet you, it was really interesting to talk to you about how your life was inspired by Amos. Not only were you born 2 weeks later, your father passed away your grandfather passed away, and then essentially your grandfather was, or the one that was talked about was Amos for your father, and he was an important part of your family. It's an important part of the lore, and you've been waving the flag for almost 80 years about the importance of this, and we're pleased to connect with you. And the family photograph at the beginning, or the photo of your grandfather and Amos together, came from your archives, and we're very pleased to have you here today. I want to just say in closing that it's with sustaining support from Hagerty, Shell, and Pennzoil that we're able to make parts of our program happen. And while we have a lot of the OEMs will work on us on programs that are specific to their brand, and a number of the auction companies support us, it's this group of companies that have been there for sustaining support for us, and we're deeply indebted to their generosity. And I guess the one final thing I just want you to think about. So if you're a car guy or a car girl, on Valentine's Day, think of Amos. If you love cars, think of Amos on Valentine's Day. That's how we'll keep it. Thank you. We'll go outside. We'll convene outside, and anybody that wants to talk about the Graham, some of the specifics, will be out there for a little bit. Thank you.
Bill, I don't